Hello everyone, Alexa Dunn here, and today I want to talk about what you should do after you leave your agent in terms of how do you get another agent? How do you approach querying when you have previously had an agent or you have previously been published and therefore previously had an agent? And that's the thing, it's going to be slightly different depending on your situation, but increasingly I'm seeing more and more people be in this situation, whether that's leaving their first agent and having to go back into the query trenches having not sold a book, and I have been in that boat myself, or whether it's authors who are moving on to the next stage of their career and finding that it makes more sense to leave the agent who had sold their books previously and try to find a different or better fit for their career moving forward. And I've ended up helping a lot of people querying in these situations, and so I wanted to kind of talk about the different situations and offer that advice. And right up front, I will say this comes with a ton of feelings. It's a very ouchy kind of thing, and really that's why you don't see a ton of advice on this, or it doesn't come up that often, because it's something that tends to be talked about privately behind the scenes for a variety of reasons. And I'm honestly kicking myself that I didn't make a video like this before. I have made videos on signs that you might want to leave your agent and like how to actually leave your agent, like walking through how to terminate that relationship. And I'm sure in that video I covered a little bit about what to do after, but this is all about like what to actually do when you're going back out into the query trenches with previous publishing history. As always, I'm going to have timestamps down below which will help you jump around if you need to jump to your particular situation, because I am going to start with the situation where you have left an agent, whether you left them or they let you go, but they hadn't sold any work for you. So you have not debuted as an author and you have to go back into the query trenches to get a new agent. So there are a variety of factors you have to consider here, and the first one is, what is the situation with your book and or books? Did the agent you were with submit the book that they signed you for? Have you been on submission with one or more books? If you haven't been on submission at all, this is easier than in any other situation, because you can, provided you check your contract and are sure that the agent isn't going to claim commission on it should it sell, which I'll talk about in a second. As long as you're clear there, you can query the same book. I have seen situations where someone signs with an agent and they work with them for a few months and they realize it's a bad fit for whatever reason, but they haven't gone on sub, so the manuscript is still good to go and you can go back out and query it. And honestly, in that situation, it's almost like you've never had an agent, and in that situation, I wouldn't even mention it in the query. Just query like it is a fresh project to query, though that can of course be complicated, because if you got an agent before for it, you probably would have exhausted people from your query list, but maybe you've done a revision and you can query it as like a revised version. That kind of gets more into like a general querying issue. Now, if the book has been on submission in any form, in any permutation, 95% of the time that book is dead, or books are dead if you were with an agent who submitted multiple books. I know this sucks, and this is where the feelings start to come up, and the panic and just feeling kind of out of control and in despair. And I know that it really sucks, but the reason for this is there's twofold reasons. One, in almost every agent-agency contract, there is a clause, and this is something you should do when you are terminating your relationship. You need to find that clause and figure out what the situation is, and if it's a really grabby clause, you might have to ask for them to waive it. Every contract has a clause that any editor that they submitted your book to, if you part ways, up to some contracts it's a year, standard is more like 6 months, but if your book sells to anyone that they submitted to, though some say if your book sells at all within 6 months to a year, some go further than that, and I'm not a fan, of you terminating the relationship or them terminating the relationship, they are entitled to the commission. And so no new agent is going to want to sell that book for you because they will literally get $0 for it. So this is why it's important, if you see that kind of clause, if it's really an extended period of time or if it's grabby, like I personally think it is fair that if you leave an agent and within 6 months someone they had submitted the manuscript to, so they did the work, wants to buy it, that the commission would go to them. I don't think it's fair for them to say if it sells to any editor at all, even if they did zero work on it, that they would get the commission. And I definitely don't think it's fair when it's a really extended period of time, because in that kind of 5% margin in terms of exceptions. So it's really going to depend on the subhistory of the book. I have seen some cases where an agent very, very lightly submitted a manuscript and perhaps didn't submit it well, or didn't submit it to like all the usual suspects. And that book can potentially, maybe, provided that clause is waived or enough time has passed, a new agent can maybe do something with that book. But it has to be like really limited submission, like I'd say 6 editors or less. But honestly, so what you have to prepare yourself for if you think you want to try to be an exception. Some agents just don't want to touch a book that's been submitted at all because there's no fresh slate. Agents like to put together their own submission strategy for a project. It's part of their job, it's part of their magic, it's part of what they do. And so some agents will just flat out never be interested in a book that has been subbed in any way, shape, or form. So in fact, if you were the person who is thinking of leaving your agent, in terms of timing, never let an agent you think you are going to leave submit one of your books, a book. Maybe it's the first, maybe it's the second, because essentially they get a claim, a stake on that work, and it basically, you have less leverage, you have less to work with in terms of going back out into the trenches to find new representation. So most of the time in this situation, you simply have to have a new book. So what do you do in querying? So unlike the situation where if you part ways before anything ever goes on submission, that it's like you never had an agent, and I say, it's my opinion, you might as well not even mention it. It's kind of a case-by-case basis, 50-50 in terms of mentioning it, where it's a case where you were with an agent for a longer period of time, you went on submission with one or more books, and you've parted ways and you're starting fresh on a new book. I'll give you the stock standard language that you can put in your query. You're gonna hear this, which is, I have recently parted ways with my agent and I'm seeking new representation. Name of book has not been on submission. That is my personal kind of advice on how to phrase it. You can throw in an amicably there. That's like a stock way to say I've amicably parted ways with my agent, which generally you say whether that is true or not. You can also knock that off if it's not true, but this is to give them context, and this tells them a couple things. One, that you are good enough that you have been agented before, though put an asterisk next to that because I have some feelings about that. And part of that may mean in some cases that it bumps you up in the interest queue because they go, oh, well, they had an agent before, let me check this out. And 2, it tells them no one else has submitted this work. That's why I advise saying it has not been on submission. So it's really crystal clear that you are not querying a book that has been seen by any editors, that this is fresh material, thus they can start fresh with you on this book. I find that those are like the 2 things that get you off on good footing. But this brings me to, you don't have to say that you were agented before, and I do think it's a case-by-case basis, and I also think that results can vary widely. So my asterisk about that whole, well, it gets them interested in you because you were agented before, yes and no. It's really gonna depend on who your agent was, honestly, and of course if that information is publicly searchable, because I'll tell you, they're gonna Google you once you're querying them saying that you had an agent before. And I'll tell you, if you had a really good agent, yes, honestly, that's probably gonna work in your favor. It's gonna bump you up in the interest queue, like looking at your query package materials queue, because they'll be like, oh, that's like a power agent and they repped this person before. But I'll say, if your agent was lackluster in any way, if you left them because you realized they were a schmagent, if they weren't very good, don't have a good reputation, don't have a lot of strong sales, I won't say it works actively against you, but I don't think it works in your favor. I don't think you get that whole, ooh, they were agented before, so this must be worth a look, because with certain agents, if they're just not in like at a certain like level of caliber, it doesn't mean as much. You have you have an equal shot as anyone else in the slush is what I'm meaning to say. And then also just my second thought about that is, you can say it if you want, but if you don't want to say it, you don't have to. And I also think the further you get away from having been agented when you never sold a project, when you didn't sell a book, it becomes less necessary in my humble opinion. But again, it's totally down to personal preference. So when I parted ways with my first agent, we didn't sell a book. I said it in my queries initially because it was pretty fresh, and like I wanted to be like, hey, I got an agent before. Plus it was like you could find it on the internet if you looked, so like I was hardly keeping a secret. But it didn't make a difference. That book was DOA. It didn't go anywhere, and by the time I wrote my next one, which ended up being my debut, honestly my query was strong without saying to them that I had had an agent before, and I just didn't include it, and it didn't hurt me at all. I did way better querying that book than I did querying the book where I said I had parted ways with an agent. So to me, like it had been 7-8 months and it just didn't matter anymore. So you don't have to say it at all. Now we get into everything that's getting a new agent when you have had a book deal or have been published before. This is a whole other can of worms. And you are always going to disclose that you are previously published or have been agented before, because now it's essential context for any agent, because this is the case where it's a fresh slate for you in the sense that you are moving forward or moving on, but you are not like fresh. You either have a deal already or you have a book or multiple books out in the world. And when you are querying for a new agent in that situation, everything, strategy and like working relationship, etc., the approach is no longer how do I sell this person as a debut and hopefully break them out. It becomes more like, this is who this person is, this is where they stand and sit in their brand and their career, and how can I strategically as an agent work with this person? Am I interested? Do I like the writing? Do I have a strategy? Can I help this person? So you need to give them as much context as humanly possible when you are querying them. But with this comes some fun exceptions, because there are two primary ways to be querying once you already have a foot in the industry, a book deal or books out. With an option on the table or without an option on the table. I'm going to talk about with an option on the table first, but in both cases we are going to talk about the glories of being able to query without a complete book / query more your body of work than necessarily a single book, which is different to the normal querying experience though. Asterisk again, there are going to be cases where you're gonna have to do traditional querying essentially. So the first thing you need to do if you have book deals established and you have parted ways with your agent and you need to get a new one, if you have an option pending, is to check the language in the contract with your agent / agency. You need to see whether or not it says something specific about them being entitled to commission on any option works that come from contracts that they had previously negotiated. Every once in a blue moon, you're going to see that. And when you leave, you're going to have to get them to waive that if you can. Otherwise, if you do end up in that situation where either they are entitled to the commission on your option or they have already sold your option, again, this is a timing thing. If you think you are going to part ways with your agent, if you are unhappy, do not let them sell your option, because you basically handcuff yourself to a tree, bad metaphors, meaning you're going out to find a new agent where they have nothing to sell. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't find an agent in that situation. We're gonna talk about that a bit more, but it does mean that you will be less attractive to some agents because they may have to do 1, 2, 3 years of support work with you before they can sell anything for you. It depends on whether you're locked into contracts, etc. So the strongest position you can be in, honestly, as an author who has to query to get a new agent, is if you have an option on the table, your previous agent is not entitled to it, and you are with a reasonably attractive publisher with a reasonably good relationship with that publisher, and you are pretty sure they are going to want to buy your option, slash whatever you have in mind for your option is really hot. Hot property is always good when you are querying. But the reason you're in a really good position if all of those things align is that you are handing an agent an easy sale. But that said, I want to say two things about this. One, I actually advise you be slightly wary of agents who might jump on you really fast because you represent an easy sale, and really evaluate whether they love your writing, are genuinely interested in your career going forward, and don't just see you as an easy sale. Because sometimes, like if you are querying as a New York Times bestseller, for example, you will have your pick of agents, but I think that means you have to be extra careful, especially thinking about the next stage of your career and agent fit and long-term relationships, who you really want to work with and who really wants to work with you. So that I know that's like a very unicorn, like first world problem to have, but I have seen authors who have been in that situation of they have all the leverage in going back into the query trenches because they have great sales, they've had awards, or they're a bestseller, and so they end up with a ton of offers from a lot of agents. And yeah, I just encourage authors in that situation to really think, like, do they want me because I'm an easy sale, or do they want me because they're genuinely like interested and committed to growing my career with me? Something to bear in mind. And the second word of warning before I read through some sample language of how you're going to structure your query in this situation. Honestly, authors with a publishing history, gird your loins, because it's a whole new world when you're querying with any kind of publication history. Whether you've sold but your book hasn't come out, or you have had books come out. In the latter situation, agents are going to look you up on BookScan. And I hate to say it, but it's true. I have definitely seen cases. Agents will consider the hard numbers that you have sold previously, and it may factor into how interested they are in you and whether they make an offer. That said, it's not like you're screwed if you don't have a great sales history, and I don't want this to scare anyone into staying with an agent who is not a good fit for them because they didn't have some breakout runaway hit with their debut or previous books. It is always the right decision to leave if you are miserable with your agent. But what I like to warn is, like, it's going to be hard out there in the query trenches. It could potentially be hard out there in the query trenches, and you're going to go into them with so many feelings and so many chips on your shoulder and like just so much insecurity because, like, oh gosh, I mean, we don't talk enough. Like, the shame isn't deserved. It isn't real. You should never feel ashamed because you had an agent and then you left that agent, or that agent parted ways with you, but you feel it anyway. Like, I felt such shame having to go back into the query trenches. So just like prepare for the feelings. And another thing to tack on to the sales thing, again, I don't want to scare people, but as you know, like I like to be real with people. They're going to look up your sales, and also the level of interest is going to vary based on where you are published, including if you have an option. An agent might be more interested if you have an option and a good relationship with a big 5 publisher now big 4, where they know that your particular editor has the kind of clearance to offer higher advances, that they know that they can negotiate with them, over, say, if you are with a smaller publisher who's known for lower advances or just kind of is less attractive to that agent, depending on kind of where they are interested in selling and who they are interested in working with. It can, I wouldn't say it works against you. It's more of like a neutral. Certain kind of situations can be a real neutral starting point for an agent versus kind of a net positive. Just some situations an author's gonna come in with a net positive, and in other cases you're at more of a neutral. But the good news is I always firmly believe in the power of a great book and something that's really sharp and interesting and well written. Always put your best foot forward when you're going back out into the trenches. Like, make sure that option proposal shines. Make sure that you are putting forth your best and shiniest idea and blow them away with it, because something that they think is really cool, they could pivot your career in new directions. Anything that sparks that idea for them of, I love this book and I see a strategy for this person moving forward. It won't matter if you started a neutral or if you're not a runaway bestseller. Okay, so on to the nitty-gritty of how you're going to approach this in your query. So you're gonna start off with that line that I offered in the previous section. So you're gonna start off with something like, I've recently amicably parted ways with my agent and I'm seeking new representation to handle my upcoming option with name of publisher, as well as my career going forward. I like that as kind of stock language. It puts it right up front in their face. You were repped before, you want no representation, which is kind of obvious to be fair, and you can also put in your subject line, if you like, seeking new representation. That's something I recommend if you already have a publication history. I don't think you should do that if you were repped before but didn't get a book deal, because it's a slightly different situation. But in this situation, that's another way to grease the wheels and get them to get their eyes on your query. But it also tells them right up front, you have an option coming up with this specific publisher. Then you want to explain in short your publication credit history. It can be as simple as like, my debut, XYZ, was published in blank by X publisher and my next book comes out in March with the title, just like a short publication history, and then you can go into more about your option. So next, I advise that you explain when your option is due and provide any context, like have you already discussed your option with your editor? When are they expecting it? And I have one friend who was able to say, like, my editor is really excited about this project, essentially kind of saying, my editor wants to buy this book, guaranteed sale. So then you gotta tell them a little bit about it. And this is where these kind of post-pub queries do differ from traditional queries, so to speak. You're still gonna write a quasi query for the book, but I wouldn't do the full 17-year-old blah, 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 blah. You can do a short form pitch, little longer than a Twitter pitch, but it's like a slightly long elevator pitch. Give them a gist of what it is. You want to give them the primary selling points and kind of taste of what this book is. And the good thing is if you have to do an option proposal for your publisher, you're gonna want to write that short pitch anyway, so give them that. And then after that, I've advised a couple people who I have helped who have had other kind of irons in the fire, either completed books that their previous agents weren't interested in, or just like pet projects they were working with, or really strong like pitches for things that they knew that they wanted to write and move into. Let's say they were querying to get a new agent for their YA option, but they knew that they wanted to move into middle grade or had written a middle grade. After you're pitching that option material, you can just go into in brief some of those other things that you are working on, just to give them an idea of the scope, because they're not just going to be signing you for one book. You really are looking for a career agent in this case. And I recommend the kind of phrasing like, in addition to continuing to build my YA romance brand, I hope to branch out into adult romance in the next few years, to kind of give them a snapshot. Or if you have specific things, you can short pitch them there. And then personally, I recommend, people always ask, well, what do I do for the next part of the query where you're supposed to like put your first 10 pages? I would insert the pages for your option if you have them. I have seen cases where authors have queried basically pitches and not had any pages yet for an option, and I think that's okay too. And in that case, you can offer to send them material. I've seen people offer to send them the manuscript for their unpublished next book with their publisher, just as long as you are kind of offer like, hey, if you are interested, I'd be happy to discuss further, and I'm happy to send you any material for XYZ. In a nutshell, when you're querying in this situation and the next set that I'm going to talk about, you're giving them a sense of the scope of your career, what you've already done, what's up next immediately, to give them an idea of what you need from them in the short term and whether they can sell anything for you, and then a snapshot of where you want to go moving forward, again, so that they and you can determine fit. And so it is far more straightforward and easy, so to speak, if you do have an option pending, because you have that potentially guaranteed sale and you probably have an idea of what you're pitching and or have material to send. But let's talk about a situation where you have to query as a published author or soon to be published author, and you don't have something new. You don't have an option pending. And so then there are like two subsections of this. There's the one where you just don't have a new book, especially cases where you do have a couple years left on your contract, and so all you have are the books that you're already contracted to be writing. And then on the other side is you don't have an option but you should have a new book. And we'll talk about querying a completely new project when you don't have an option, i.e. something pending with your publisher. They're two similar but different situations. So I'll briefly cover the first one, which is you need an agent, you need representation, but you're locked into a contract. All you have are contract books. You won't have anything new for them to sell for at least the next year. You can still query in these situations. It might be a little tougher, but you can actually in many cases find agents who are really invested in you as a writer and in a career, and they're willing to work with you even if there's no sale in sight. So don't ever think that you are stuck with your agent for years if you're unhappy, or that you're going to be stuck without an agent for years if you've lost your agent just because you're contracted on books and you can't make an agent money. Query anyway, but you're gonna have to query a little bit differently. You'll let them know that you parted ways with your agent, you give them a snapshot of your publication history, let them know what your book contract situation is, the books that you are working on, and then you're still gonna wanna kind of summarize your hopes and plans for the future. Give them an idea of the kind of books you want to write. If you have any short pitches, include them. And again, you can offer to share any samples of your work. Probably smart to offer to send them, say, the Word doc of your contracted book. And so like in that situation, even more than the option, you were literally pitching you yourself as an author and as a brand and as like long-term career. It's a little trickier because you literally don't have a book to query and you were querying yourself. But it's definitely possible. Which brings me to the far more common / advisable one, which is if you end up in this situation where you don't have an agent anymore and you're already published and you don't have an option, which means whatever you write and what goes on submission next, it's gonna have to go on wide submission. You are hardly a guaranteed sale. You are essentially mid-career, which is a very broad term. You're a post-debut author going back into the query trenches to get an agent. And this is where it's gonna be 50-50 and it's gonna be situational whether you can query on proposal or query with a complete book. And where this gets situational is it's gonna depend on your personal situation. And that is to say, it's gonna depend on the strength of your existing publishing portfolio, your sales, and essentially the strength of your brand. And I know that's deeply depressing, but also what your plans are for next. Because the reality is in publishing, once you've already published a book, you can often go in submission on proposal. You don't have to write the entire book to go on wide submission. But I find typically, or at least the sage wisdom I have heard that I tend to agree with, even though it also hurts me personally or hurt me personally, but it worked out, is if the book that you want to write next is pretty much in line with your established brand and there won't be anything kind of unexpected or surprises, i.e. nothing that would trigger questions about your ability to successfully pull off the book, if that makes sense. You can probably query on proposal because the agent can probably submit you on proposal, because the agent would be able to go out to publishers and say, this author's published 4 YA romances, for example, and like, let's say you've been moderately popular. A publisher would be able to look at a proposal and go, oh, well, they've written 4 books before for a major / respected publisher and they've done pretty well. I don't need to read the entire book to consider this for publication and potentially make an offer. Plenty of agents and authors submit on proposal once they have already been published. So in that case, you would basically do exactly my advice for the option part, except you don't get to say, this is my option book. You're basically saying, my next book is X, and you're short pitching it. You might want to pitch it like a little longer than on the option one because you maybe need to sell them a little bit more. But again, you can just include the pages from that book. So you will have to at least write a partial of a manuscript to query on proposal. You have to write the proposal. But in a lot of cases, there's no problem querying as an already published author without a new complete book. I know that stresses out a ton of people because they go, I have to go back out and query again, because sometimes you lose your agent not willingly. Things happen and you are thrown back out into the world and it's really stressful. You don't always have to have a complete book. That is the good news. But this is situational, as I mentioned. So this is personal opinion, but also just kind of like, not necessarily best practices, but like better practices. I personally advise if you're in a situation where your sales and or brand aren't the strongest, or if you're in a situation where you know that like what you really want for your career is an upgrade from your publisher, for example. Like maybe your previous books were with a smaller, really great publisher, but your dream is the big five, for example. Or if you're doing any kind of hard pivot, if you were switching genres, especially to one where editors typically are gonna wanna read the entire book, and my experience with this is as a thriller writer, this is why I didn't submit my thriller on proposal, my first thriller on proposal. My agent advised, and she was totally right, to write the entire thing, because thrillers are all about essentially the proof in the pudding, the entire book, especially the ending. So it behooved me to prove that I could basically write one, and it was stronger to go on submission with a complete manuscript. So if you are in a situation, honestly, if you have even the slightest doubts re the strength of you querying on proposal as an already published author and selling on proposal as an already published author for whatever you have in mind for the next step of your career, write the whole book. Write the whole book, polish the book as much as you can, because you want to put your best foot forward in the query trenches. And this is where we basically revert back to the previous advice. You're not gonna query like you were querying an option. You're not gonna short pitch. You're gonna write a normal query. You're gonna like sell the book. Sell the book as a whole book. You're saying it's complete at X words, you're doing the whole pitch, comps, the whole 9 yards. I mean, on the option stuff, you can use comps as well. And the only difference between that and the first scenario of leaving your agent or losing your agent when you haven't sold anything is, unlike there where I say it's kind of 50-50 optional whether you mention that you were agented before, on this one, of course, you're gonna mention your publication history, like with the option example. So you will start with, I recently parted ways with my agent. I am published with X publisher with these titles. I hope you will consider my next project, and then you go into it. And then just to address a question that I have also seen come up, because I have mentioned multiple projects. What if you have multiple projects? There are some writers who are super prolific and they legit have multiple completed books. And so when they're going out to find a new agent, they really do have a lot of different things they can query. I personally say pick a primary project that you're like pitching first. It's like the first thing that you're gonna talk about. But then you could honestly, I've seen this, do a bullet pointed list of what some of those other things are, short pitch them, like do the comps and like say at what stage they're at, whether they're complete or not, and basically to give them a scope of what you're doing. But I personally advise you pick like a primary. So for example, let's say you have YA, middle grade, and adult. Pick the one that like you really want to focus on, and then like list out the others, like whatever is kind of like the primary stream of your career, even if you hope to eventually have balance doing more than one. Or if you're pivoting, if you want to pivot into middle grade but previously your publication credits have been YA, maybe that's the reason you're seeking a new agent, or adult, insert whatever fits here, or genre. Lead with the thing that you really want to move into. And where I will leave you kind of the conclusion section is, I do just want to give some more warnings. Just to talk about kind of the current state of the market and querying, because I think what's really important, especially as I am genuinely seeing the numbers increase of people who are needing to find new agents on all sides. I'm talking about all of these are scenarios that I have seen in friends and people who I have helped go back out and get new agents. And I'm pleased to report most of them have new agents. And so the first thing is like, you're gonna have so many feelings. Don't be too scared. Like, gird your loins, but don't be too scared, because it is scary. And if you're watching this because you're actually thinking of leaving your agent and you're like, I just don't know if I can go back out there, first of all, that's a legitimate feeling. It takes as long as it takes for you to come to a decision and take that scary step and get back out there. And generally it holds true that if you can get an agent once, / if you've been published, you can probably get one again. You can get one again, because it's all an odds game and it's all a numbers game, and you did it once, and honestly that is impressive in and of itself. That is a feat, and not everyone can do that. And so generally, like, repeat that to yourself when you're having a rough day, because it is true. But the kind of tough love market talk part / warning is the same warning and advice I give to currently querying people who have never been agented before. But like, I have to point it out because if you haven't been in the trenches in a while, and this is mostly specific to YA, but does apply to other areas, things may have changed since the last time you queried. If you've had an agent for years and you've been publishing, things have changed in the trenches, and also just things have shifted in the market. And generally, I'm finding most people querying is harder than it ever was before. It's slower. A lot more agents are non-responders. There's a lot more ghosting that goes on. Also, a lot of kind of leading agents, big agents. Some of this is COVID effect, and we're hoping that it'll kind of, we'll have some bounce back, but a lot of agents just no longer have the bandwidth to continue to expand their list. They're not taking new clients. You might find that you need to expand your querying strategy, that it can't just be, oh, well, I was with this really great agent. If I don't get an agent who I consider better than that agent, like it's that or bust or failure. That isn't necessarily the best approach in a really tight querying market, especially for YA. You might find that you're better served by a younger and hungrier agent, which I know is like not necessarily what everyone wants. Generally, I think there's a lot of kind of feelings and it's like identity stuff that comes with the whole having an agent, leaving an agent, going back out, where we like have an idea in our mind, whether we like it or not, of what we want and what we feel we deserve. And I know that's really tricky to talk about, but like you're gonna have some knocks to your ego in this process is what I mean in many cases. And it's gonna feel worse than it ever did before you were published, before you had an agent in the first place, because it's like that almost like so close but not quite feeling. And I just find that it's especially emotionally turbulent. And that is why I do advise, like, if you're going back out, you have to go out with your best material, because it is more competitive than ever in the query trenches. The market is saturated. Mid-career is becoming more and more challenging. And so just my advice and word of warning is, don't stay in a bad situation for fear of having to go back out into the query trenches. You should always do what's best for you in your career. But when you go back out into the query trenches, make sure that query package is really, really sharp. Make sure the material is good. Put your best foot forward in querying, and then prepare for feelings, prepare for the worst so that, you can be delighted by the best, essentially, because you might be in for a wait. I've seen published authors go back into the trenches and get an offer in 24 hours. I've seen them go back into the trenches and query for 3 or more months. And it varies, and every single situation is different. So that's another thing. More than ever, don't play the comparison game. And I know that that's really hard to do. But once you already have a publishing history, your experiences going back into the trenches are going to be so hyper specific to you and what you were querying. So yeah, that's kind of my jumbled thoughts on that. Let me know down below in the comments if you have any questions. I know this is a really tricky subject to talk about, but know that you are not alone. For better or for worse, I have legitimately seen these numbers increasing over the last like 18 months, and that could be a natural kind of result of my debut cohort kind of maturing. It's perfectly okay and honestly pretty normal to have more than one agent. Very few people get that first agent and stay with them forever. I'm on agent number 2, so like no shame. You're gonna feel your feelings, but you're gonna be okay. Querying is a ride when you have already been agented / have a publication history, but it's not as bad as you fear necessarily, and it's gonna be okay. Give this video a thumbs up if you like it. I will make more kind of nitty-gritty industry advice type videos, and if you're not already subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do that. I post new videos 2 to 3 times a week. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and happy writing, but good luck querying.